They assumed that a minor HOA penalty would force me to submit to their power-hungry demands, unaware that they had just antagonized the very man responsible for law and order in our community. What they didn't realize was that once I began exposing their unlawful operations, targeting our community's dedicated first responders, I would become the predator in their twisted game. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to comment from wherever you're watching. I'll never forget that fateful morning. It began like any other day and ended up forever changing our neighborhood. As I stepped out to my car, prepared for another shift at the station, I noticed a bright neon green slip wedged beneath my windshield wiper. At first, I assumed it was another restaurant flyer, but my heart sank when I recognized it as an HOA violation notice, a $89 fine for what they claimed was improper lawn maintenance. I stood there in my uniform, coffee in hand, staring at my yard, which, for the past 15 years, had been as green, healthy, and regularly mowed as ever. Sure, it wasn't a perfect golf course, but it was neat and well cared for. Then I heard the unmistakable clack of high heels on the sidewalk. "Good morning," came a voice that was both saccharine and sharp enough to make my teeth ache. It was Karen Mitchell, the newest addition to the HOA board, out on her morning inspection with her tablet in hand. She had moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and had wasted no time campaigning for a board seat. Now, barely 3 weeks into her role, she was making life miserable for everyone. I greeted her with a nod and held up the notice, explaining calmly, "My lawn meets all reasonable standards." She barely glanced up from her screen before replying in a clipped tone, "Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Yours is approximately 3.5 inches. As she tapped away on her tablet, likely logging yet another violation, I inhaled deeply, recalling my training in dealing with difficult individuals. "I've been tied up with a major case this week. I'll mow it over the weekend. Rules are rules," I said, maintaining my composure. Then she chirped, "And if the fine isn't paid within 72 hours, it doubles. Oh, and you might want to address those garden gnomes. They're not on the approved decoration list." I felt my blood pressure spike as I looked at the collection of gnomes my late wife had lovingly amassed over a decade. "I wasn't aware that garden decorations needed HOA approval," I replied evenly. "New board, new rules," she said brightly while waving her tablet as though it were a scepter. "We're bringing this neighborhood into the modern age. No more tacky decor that lowers property values." As she continued down the sidewalk, I noticed her pausing in front of the house belonging to Alicia Rivera, an ER nurse who had just completed a grueling night shift. The last thing Alicia needed was Karen's early morning harassment about her garbage bins being left out too long. I watched as Karen began snapping photos of Alicia's property, and something inside me shifted. This wasn't merely about my lawn or my gnomes anymore. In my 25 years in law enforcement, I'd learned to recognize the signs of harassment and abuse of power. Karen wasn't just strict, she was deliberately targeting specific residents. Back in my car, I scrolled through our neighborhood Facebook group. The complaints about Karen were mounting. Derek, the local firefighter, had been fined for his kid's basketball hoop. An elderly couple on the opposite side of the street had received a citation for their unapproved rose bushes. Even a nearby schoolteacher had been penalized for parking his car in his own driveway because, according to her, it was too old and unsightly. I was about to pull out of my driveway when I spotted Karen taking more pictures of my own garden gnomes. She hadn't yet realized that she was about to cross a line. You see, being chief of police has taught me that sometimes the most serious crimes aren't headline grabbers, but rather the small injustices that gradually erode the spirit of a community. As I drove to work, my mind already began to formulate a plan. Karen thought she held all the power, yet she had no idea who she was really dealing with or what I would soon uncover behind her perfectly polished facade. 2 days after that absurd lime green ticket, I encountered a scene that left me incredulous. 2 black SUVs emblazoned with HOA security blocked my driveway entirely. I had just wrapped up a grueling double shift, dealing with a bank robbery downtown, and all I wanted was to park and catch some rest. But Karen Mitchell had other plans. I watched through my windshield as she strutted across my front yard in a designer suit, tablet in hand, snapping photos of everything from my garden hose to my welcome mat. With every flash of her camera, my pulse quickened, but I maintained my cool. After 2 decades on the force, I knew that losing my temper would get me nowhere. I stepped out of my car and called out, "Excuse me, your vehicles are blocking my driveway and I need access to my garage." Karen spun around, her perfectly styled blonde hair bouncing as if in a shampoo commercial. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Wallace, our neighborhood's most notorious rule breaker," she remarked, tapping her tablet with long red nails. "Let's see. An unpaid fine for excessive lawn height, unapproved garden gnome placement, and now," she paused dramatically before adding, "a non-regulation mailbox color." I couldn't help but chuckle. "My mailbox is white, and it has been for the 15 years I've lived here. According to the new guidelines, mailboxes must be painted pristine pearl white from the Anderson Paint Company collection. Mine is classic white, just a slightly different shade." She smiled as though she had solved a mystery. Then I pulled out my phone and began recording. "Karen, I understand you're new to the neighborhood, but these security vehicles are parked illegally. They're obstructing access to my property, a clear violation of City Ordinance 20-345. For a fleeting moment, her smile faltered. "I have full authority as an HOA board member to enforce our community standards," she insisted, gesturing toward 2 men in ill-fitting uniforms leaning against the SUVs. "These security officers are here to ensure compliance." That's when I noticed something peculiar about their badges. They bore a resemblance to legitimate police badges, but something was off. As Chief Anderson, I knew every licensed security firm in our jurisdiction, and I couldn't recall any record of Mitchell Security Solutions. I took a deep breath and tried reasoning with her one more time. "Look, I understand you're trying to uphold property values, but blocking someone's driveway over a $89 fine isn't just unreasonable. It's illegal. I'd hate to have to escalate this matter." Her face flushed to match her nail polish. "Is that a threat, Mr. Wallace? Because I have photos documenting every violation on your property, and the HOA board will be very interested in your defiant behavior." She then turned to the security guards, ordering them, "Make a note of his threatening demeanor." As they fumbled with their notepads, I noticed their shoulder patches were peeling, as if printed on a copy machine at a local shop. Something wasn't adding up, and my instincts kicked in. I pulled up the city's business license database on my phone, while keeping a wary eye on Karen, who continued to photograph my property. Within a few taps, I confirmed what I suspected. No licensed security company was registered under her name or under that of her brother, whom I had seen at the last HOA meeting wearing a similar uniform. Just then, Mrs. Ramirez from next door burst out in her nurse's scrubs. "Chief Anderson, I'm so relieved you're here. They've been blocking my driveway too, and I'm late for my hospital shift." I watched as Karen's eyes widened imperceptibly when she heard the title Chief. For a moment, her tablet nearly slipped from her fingers, but instead she straightened her chin and declared, "Your title doesn't matter here, Chief Anderson. HOA rules apply equally to everyone. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to document a few more violations before processing additional fines for your uncooperative behavior." Clutching her clipboard as if it were armor, she strode away, and I knew then that this was only the beginning. Karen's meticulously crafted HOA world was about to unravel, especially once I started investigating how these new security measures had even been approved. I never expected that a simple dispute over lawn care would lead me to uncover something so disturbing in our otherwise peaceful neighborhood. It all escalated when Alicia, our local ER nurse, knocked on my door at 6 a.m., still in her scrubs and fighting back tears. She had just endured a brutal overnight shift responding to a bus crash, only to find her entire front yard plastered with bright orange violation notices. "Chief," she said, hands trembling as she held up the stack of papers, They're threatening to put a lien on my house because my garbage bin was left out an extra day while I was on a double shift during the crisis." The sight of a dedicated nurse who had spent 16 hours saving lives being harassed over garbage bins set my blood boiling. But Alicia wasn't alone. As I began asking around, more stories emerged. Derek, the local firefighter, showed me citation after citation for his kid's basketball hoop, the very same hoop that had stood undisturbed for 5 years until Karen joined the board. The Martinez family, reeling from a recent family tragedy, had been fined because their Christmas lights remained up 2 days past Karen's arbitrary deadline. That evening, I spread out all the complaints at my kitchen table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The pattern was unmistakable. Karen wasn't merely being pedantic. She was targeting homes where residents worked long or irregular hours. Doctors, nurses, firefighters, people who couldn't always be home to promptly respond to her demands were being singled out. My police instincts kicked in as I mapped out every citation issued in the 3 months since Karen's arrival on the board. The violations clustered around homes of emergency workers and those who had opposed her during the HOA election. This wasn't random. It was calculated harassment. Soon after, Deputy Larson texted me. "Chief Anderson, you won't believe this. Remember the flooding issue last spring? I just found out that Karen's brother's company was awarded the contract for drainage repair at 3 times the competitive bid." I leaned back in my chair, recalling the smug smile Karen had worn earlier when I questioned the fines. "Rules are rules," she had said. But now I understood. These weren't rules at all. They were tools for a power trip, and perhaps even something far more sinister. Then the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Lee, an elderly widow who had lived here longer than anyone else. "Chief, I'm so worried," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "They're installing cameras on the streetlights today without any permission, and they're all aimed at specific houses, even yours." My jaw tightened. Unauthorized surveillance in my jurisdiction was a serious offense, and it became clear that Karen was no mere nuisance. She was potentially breaking the law. Yet I needed more evidence before I could take action. If I moved too hastily, she would claim I was abusing my authority as Chief Anderson. While escorting Mrs. Lee back to her home, I spotted Karen in her driveway, conversing with 2 unfamiliar men in uniforms that bore an uncanny resemblance to those from her brother's security company. Something about their appearance seemed off. My gut told me there was more to this story, a gut feeling honed by 20 years on the force that had rarely led me astray. I recalled the words of my mentor, "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." Karen had built a little kingdom of fear and intimidation, but she had made one fatal error. She'd become overly confident and sloppy. She didn't realize that while she was busy watching us, we were watching her too. The true question was no longer about stopping Karen. It was about exposing the entire corrupt system she had constructed. I spent hours that day poring over evidence. Property maps that revealed Karen had extended her back fence 2 feet past her property line. Security camera footage from my cruiser that showed her company had repeatedly blocked emergency vehicle access, and HOA financial records that indicated she had been pushing for higher fines while funneling all security contracts to her brother's firm. Every new piece of evidence made it increasingly clear that Karen was not just enforcing arbitrary rules. She was abusing her power for personal gain. I never imagined that a simple dispute over lawn height would spiral into an investigation of systemic corruption. The final nail came when Alicia, the exhausted ER nurse, arrived at my station with another violation notice. "Chief Anderson," she said, voice shaking, "I can't keep paying these fines on a nurse's salary." The notice, like all the others, was signed by Karen and cited some obscure rule that seemed designed specifically to target hardworking people. At the station, I dug deeper into public records. I discovered that Karen's brother, Randall Mitchell, had a long history of failed security companies in 3 different states, each time mired in complaints about aggressive tactics and unauthorized vehicle blockades. And every time, The investigations fizzled out before any accountability could be reached. My next stop was the county clerk's office. Mrs. Hernandez, the kindly clerk, helped me retrieve recent HOA registration documents. Flipping through the pages, I found the smoking gun. Karen had never disclosed her familial connection to the security company when she bid for the HOA contract, a blatant violation of the board's own conflict of interest rules. The most damning evidence, however, came when I checked Karen's home business registration. It turned out she had been running an unlicensed daycare out of her garage, caring for up to 6 children at a time, a direct violation of HOA regulations that strictly forbade commercial activities. The very same rules she had been invoking to fine residents for having home offices were being used against her. My phone buzzed with a message from Derek. "Chief, you need to see this. I've got photos of Karen's security company vehicles parked in fire lanes. As a firefighter, I know exactly how dangerous this is. Emergency vehicles wouldn't be able to pass if needed." I spent the rest of the afternoon assembling my case. Property maps, security footage, financial records, and business licenses all pointed to one conclusion. Karen had been using her position to push an agenda that not only harassed her neighbors, but also put public safety at risk. I meticulously copied every document and stored them in both digital and physical formats, a habit ingrained in me after years on the force. Just as Officer Hernandez rushed into my office with news that a security vehicle had nearly towed Dr. Green's car from the emergency room entrance, I realized I had gathered the final piece of evidence. Sitting back in my chair, I surveyed the wall of evidence. Karen had no inkling of what was coming. In her quest to build her personal empire of power, she had left behind a trail of violations that would astound even her staunchest supporters on the board. The next step was critical, timing the revelation perfectly. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my sergeants. Karen had just submitted a proposal for expanded security measures. An emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following night. I smiled to myself. Sometimes the best investigations are those where you let your target walk right into the trap they set for others. That evening, as I entered the packed meeting room, my heart pounded steadily while my face remained composed. Karen stood at the front, clad in her designer suit, waving a stack of papers outlining her new community safety program. She droned on about hiring more security guards and installing cameras on every street, while the room, tired of her draconian rules, sat in uneasy silence. I waited until she concluded her speech on protecting property values before raising my hand. Before a vote could be taken, I stood and said, "I think there's something everyone here needs to know." Karen's eyes narrowed as she recognized me out of uniform. "I'm Chief Anderson," I announced, "and I've been investigating some very concerning issues." I then produced my own stack of documents, property records, business licenses, and photographs, and connected them to the projector. The screen lit up with images showing Karen's illegal home daycare operation, which blatantly violated HOA regulations and state laws. "These pictures reveal an unlicensed daycare being run out of your home, Karen," I said calmly. "That's a direct violation of both HOA guidelines and state regulations." Her face flushed with fury. "How dare you? This is private property. Public records aren't private," she snapped. I smoothly shifted to the next slide. "Neither is this business registration, which clearly shows that your brother, Randall Mitchell, owns a security company that is now patrolling our streets without proper licensing." The room erupted in murmurs. "While you were busy fining Alicia for leaving her trash bins out an extra hour after her shift, you were operating an illegal business and targeting Derek for his children's basketball hoop," I continued. Mrs. Lee from down the street stood up, recounting how she'd been fined $200 for what she claimed were non-compliant Chinese New Year decorations. One by one, neighbors began sharing their own stories of harassment and unfair fines. Before Karen could grab her papers and storm out, the HOA president, Mr. Parker, intervened. "Not so fast, Karen. We need to discuss this," he said. I then laid out evidence of every arbitrary fine, every fabricated rule, and every double standard. As I presented the final slide, a damning photo of a security vehicle blocking a driveway, I declared, "This security company has been impersonating law enforcement without any legal authority." Karen's carefully constructed mask finally began to crack. "You can't prove any of this!" she cried. "I'm simply making the neighborhood better by enforcing rules." I replied firmly, "Rules must apply to everyone, and that includes you." The room burst into applause as Mr. Parker called for an emergency vote. Neighbors raised their hands in unison. In the end, Karen was not only removed from the board, she was banned from ever serving again. As she pushed past everyone, tears of rage streaming down her face, she shouted, "This isn't over!" But looking around at the united community, I knew that sometimes justice isn't just about wearing a badge. It's about having the courage to stand up and speak the truth. Later that night, I organized all the evidence in a meticulously labeled folder. The meeting room had been packed. More neighbors had shown up than I'd ever seen. Karen sat at the front table, absorbed in her tablet, as if she still owned the place. Before the vote on the new security measures, I stepped forward and addressed the board. For those who don't know me, I'm James Carter. I've been a resident here for 15 years, and I serve as chief of police for our city. A hush fell over the room. Karen's tablet clattered to the table as her brother, Randall Mitchell, now looking extremely uncomfortable in his seat by the door, shifted in silence. I continued. In the past 3 months, there have been 47 fines issued in our community. 35 of them have been levied against first responders and essential workers. Here is a color-coded map showing every citation. Notice the clusters. The board members leaned in, studying the red dots intently. Mrs. Franklin, our retired school principal, and the longest-serving board member, adjusted her glasses with trembling hands. "But that's not all," I added, producing additional documents. "The security company hired to enforce these citations, Mitchell Security Solutions, is not only unlicensed, it's operating illegally under state law." At that moment, Randall tried to rise and exit, but 2 uniformed officers stationed outside prevented his departure. "This is absurd!" Karen shouted. "You can't use police resources for personal vendettas." I smiled and replied, "That's exactly why every piece of evidence I'm presenting comes from public records and legitimate legal channels." I then showcased the documents linking her home daycare to violations of Section 7 of the HOA agreement. The room erupted as neighbors began to share their own grievances, from a single mother fined for her Christmas lights during a double shift to an elderly couple harassed over the color of their medical equipment delivery van. Mrs. Lee's voice rang out clearly. "I've had enough of these arbitrary fines." Without warning, I moved to remove Karen Mitchell from the board and announced that a full audit of all fines issued under her authority would commence immediately. In protest, several voices shouted, "You can't do this!" Karen's face drained of color as she stammered about protecting property values and maintaining standards. "No," I said quietly. "You were bullying people who didn't have the time or means to fight back. That ends today." The vote was unanimous. As Karen stormed out, her designer handbag swinging wildly, neighbors began embracing one another. Alicia, still tearful, clutched Derek as they wept in relief. I stayed late, assisting Mrs. Franklin in processing the paperwork to refund every unjust fine. Over $115,000 in total, each one more absurd than the last. Neighbors dropped by with coffee, snacks, and their own stories of relief. The following morning, while driving to work, I passed by Karen's house. A moving truck was already parked in her driveway, and her brother's security vehicles had been replaced by legitimate patrol cars operating with proper permits. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Soon, children played in their yards without fear of citations, and Mrs. Ramirez organized a community barbecue to celebrate the return of common sense. A week later, I was watering my lawn exactly 3.5 inches tall, when Alicia's young daughter ran up with a handmade card. The crayon drawing depicted me in my police uniform standing in front of a rainbow-colored house, and the message read, "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." That card now hangs on my desk at the station, a constant reminder that sometimes the most important work is done right at home. Our community learned a valuable lesson. It's not about having power, it's about how you choose to use it. And as for Karen, the last I heard, she tried to join another HOA board in a neighboring town. But word had already spread about her experience with us. The information in this video is for informational and entertainment purposes only. HOA rules and laws vary by state and community.